Imagine for a moment a world without art, without dance, opera, literature, poetry. That world would be a very, very dull place.
Today on the show, we have Craig Williams, a yogi with over 15 years of academic and Gurukula training in Ayurveda yoga, Jyotish yoga, Vedanta yoga, and Tantra yoga. Awarded the prestigious title of Veda Kovid and the Yogacharya of the American Institute of Vedic Studies. He has a master's degree in Oriental Medicine and is a certified nutritionist and acupuncturist. Not only is he an adept at Hinduism, but he also studies various forms of Gnosticism, voudon, and other Western esoteric traditions. Craig, want to thank you for taking the time out of your day to talk with me about your beliefs and perspective on life.
Oh, it's an honor to be here. Thank you so much.
Oh, fantastic. Well, one of the things I definitely wanted to touch your brain on is that you are, out of all the folks that I was kind of researching and looking into, to kind of interview for the podcast, you have the most particular and I would say interesting perspective. Primarily like reading some of your more Western-based stuff. You have influences and you have perspectives from across the spiritual smorgasbord, let's say. So I'd definitely love to gauge when you first got interested in like meditation, Hinduism. We'll start on more of the Eastern stuff before we go over to the Western.
Absolutely, yeah. I was very interested in Eastern studies as a child. I think I could probably attribute to that to probably being exposed to Hare Krishna books as a young child. That was around me. One of the first books I remember getting was the Bhagavad-Gita from ISKCON, or the Prabhupada Hare Krishna movement. Mm-hmm. And I was fascinated with that, fascinated with the images, with the words. And so that was probably some type of karmic connection I had as a youth, and that kind of set me on my path for life. That was around 11 or 12 years old. But I also grew up with a deep love for martial arts and kung fu and Taoism, so it was kind of already there.
Okay, so you were practicing kung fu then before you started getting into Hinduism?
Absolutely.
Oh, so what sort of martial arts were you into, and how young did you get started on that?
I was obsessed with Bruce Lee and Wing Chun and Kung Fu since I was old enough to read a book. And so that was something that since I was like 8 or 9 years old. And luckily my parents were incredibly supportive of that. And that's something I've continued on into this day. And I love all styles of martial arts. Chinese Kung Fu and Wing Chun and Praying Mantis are probably my favorites, but I'm a huge fan of boxing and I love MMA. And so I love all those different styles. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know, the martial arts, particularly starting at a young age. I guess to a lesser extent, any, real physical activity. They just ingrain with you the sense of discipline and self-worth that you really can't get doing anything else than challenging yourself in, martial arts just in general challenges you mentally, spiritually, and physically. So, it really just tests you on every level and kind of prepares you for, the intense focus that would be needed to kind of, go towards more of that spiritual path that you went on.
I 100% agree. I attribute most of my ingrained devotion and stamina and focus to being trained in martial arts at a young age and kind of being steeped in that environment. Absolutely.
So I guess, just to get more technical then what were some of the, specific meditations that really helped you concentrate your focus and kind of, get into this mindset that, failure, giving up, it just isn't an option because, folks, particularly with a martial arts background, like they have a will of steel. Some of them can, just sit in one position, primarily if you're doing, yoga for hours on end, and it just takes, I don't know, almost like a level of separation that you can kind of, disregard those, pains, annoyances that you're experiencing and just kind of center yourself.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think for me in particular was, most of the martial arts I was learning was from Asian practitioners when I was young. So I was very lucky for that. And I was very interested in Qigong and Taoism, along the internal arts of Kung Fu, along with the external arts. And I started to notice as a young person that the more physically fit I was, the easier it was to meditate, the easier it was to tolerate frustrations. And so, as opposed to trying to transcend the body, Kung Fu and martial arts told me that actually, in many ways, I need to be sure I'm harmonizing with the body. And then once I harmonize with the body, then I'm harmonizing with the elements, I'm harmonizing with my emotions.
Right.
And then, so when I got old enough to really kind of get to the occult and Gnostic studies, that was already there. And I'm very grateful for that.
Now, I feel like that's where I'm always lacking, is that I have no discipline whatsoever. I don't know, well, which is apparent because, usually when it comes to like, the more esoteric interest, I'm always jumping from subject to subject. I can never stick on one thing for too
Sure.
long, whether it's, learn why. I know in previous discussions we had talked about Crowley, different streams of Gnosticism. And like, I feel like that's where a lot of folks have trouble getting into, these more metaphysical topics, is that there's so many different subjective experiences from so many different teachers and so many different perspectives on the material that it's hard to find one path to focus on, and it's hard to find what resonates for you as an individual when there's so much out there.
That's a very important point, and especially in an age of such easy access to information, right? I mean, I remember growing up. I'm 50, so I remember growing up without the internet, right? I didn't have the internet when I was young. I didn't have it in high school, so access to information was much harder to grasp and to get at that time. But I think that is a modern problem. We see it's a contemporary problem. We see that I often refer to that as cafeteria occultism. People are just kind of picking and choosing what they want.
Right.
Some of that's good, some of it's bad, and a lot of it does come with what the environment in which you were raised with, and if you had people that encouraged you to follow things you found interesting. And I was very lucky as a child to have an environment which is very conducive to exploration and learning. And as a young child, I was very much interested in Rudolf Steiner. I was extremely interested in Aleister Crowley at the same time when I was reading any book from ISKCON, Hare Krishna movement that I could get my hands on. And for some reason, the systems from India just really called to me, really struck with me, and that to this day is the foundation of all of my esoteric work. However, I have a great love for many streams of esoteric work from Europe, from the Western worlds, and Gnosticism in general. And my background is very eclectic with that too. So I don't think it's necessarily bad for people to do that, but I do think most people need some kind of root tradition to ground themselves in.
Right. Well, I mean, I think also, primarily a lot of folks who are, looking into the more esoteric side of things. I'm not going to speak in generalities too much, but I'm just going to say the majority of them were dissatisfied with the, tradition they had growing up. And they're just
Yes.
seeking something more, right? And
Yeah.
and when you kind of when the thing that you grew up with kind of leaves a bad taste in your mouth, I feel like people look into all these different traditions and they're just waiting for like that feeling or some experience that kind of grounds them into a tradition that kind of makes them feel as if it resonates with them. So let me ask, was there any specific first, like spiritual experience that you had when you first started getting into Hinduism that kind of solidified your belief and your efforts and the energy that you wanted to put into that path?
Yeah, that's a good point. I was very lucky to grow up in a very healthy spiritual environment. And my family was very liberal Lutheran, but I was sent to Catholic schools all my life,
Mm-hmm.
And that was in Louisiana, which was a very mystical, kind of strange Southern Gothic culture
I love
that was
Louisiana.
steeped in Catholicism, but also hoodoo
Yeah.
and strange spiritualist traditions were there, and so that I was immersed in that. So, but it was all very positive. I had nothing which bothered me or repressed me, and I could easily kind of read Crowley and Steiner and go to everything. There was nothing kind of causing that. So I was very lucky in that way. But I did find when I was young, and I would read the Bhagavad-Gita and the Upanishads, and in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, and I would do these practices from yoga, that I would have very clear experiences. That what they described was very clearly happening,
Mm-hmm.
and I had the same thing happen to me when I would study Rudolf Steiner and I would do his particular esoteric practices. I would see clear experiences. And so I have to say this, for me as a child and as a young person, the esoteric world was already alive. It wasn't something that I had to search for. And I had a lot of very strange paranormal experiences as a child, which I think just showed me that there was other dimensions out there. And I was more interested in exploring them. I didn't have anything that I never questioned it really. Actually, it was already there, and so for me, it was just more about what is going on, what is how can we explore this mystical, beautiful world, and then from them, I just kind of followed my gut, my heart, and which we would definitely call from India. It was just my swadharma, my dharma, my karma.
Right.
I was just kind of following that.
So then, I guess just to kind of back up then. So when you were doing these practices, and they were just kind of opening the doors of different modes of consciousness, let's say, and
Yes.
you started allowing yourself to be more in tune with certain God forms. Was there any specific God form that just kind of resonated with you that that just I mean, to put it from like a Christian lens, a lot of folks when they're praying to the saints, they're in tuning that spiritual form of that saint, right, within themselves.
Right.
But when you were first getting started, which God, I guess, kind of gave you the most positive experiences that you had just getting going?
I think as a child, it would have been Krishna and Shiva. Those two things as a child I felt very connected to. And then I had very beautiful experiences with Ganesh. And so that kind of really colored my world, and everything kind of exploded from there.
Ganesh was the only Hindu-based god that I've ever had an experience with. Even to the point that I dream about him, and I was never really into Hinduism. Whenever I mean, to the extent that I'd read a couple Wikipedia articles, and whenever I'm at a music festival and I see the guy taking donations for book, no matter what, I just get one. I always buy a book, and I've always tried to put the effort into reading them, but the names just get so confusing, primarily different places, that I just get so lost in my dyslexia that I could never follow through. But Ganesh was one of those beings that it just made me feel so calm and at peace. And I mean, the entire dream I had is I was floating up, and the tube that I was floating up ended up being a tunnel that was kind of morphing into a hallway. And there I am in this lavish room with all these fancy silk curtains everywhere, and lamps, and you're sitting before this supreme godhead, right? And what does he do? He offers you a piece of candy.
That's beautiful.
I mean, it just resonated with me. He's a fat man's god, so I'm all about it. And so, Ganesh, I've always put him in different paintings whenever I have the time to. I used to have a little, shrine set up to him that I'd give out offerings here and there. But, I've never really looked at Hinduism as a spiritual path. So, I guess if I were to want to shift my consciousness in that direction, what would a mediocre Western-based, also born Lutheran guy do to kind of shift his mind in that perspective?
Well, first of all, thank you for sharing that beautiful experience of Ganesh. I loved hearing that. I mean, honestly, I would say that you kind of revealed two things with that. Anyone who hasn't experienced that, a dream or a connection like that, that it already shows that those kind of types of cosmic forces are already communicating with you and are at least open to communicating with you. And Ganesh is particularly propitious one because Ganesh rules the earth plane, rules the earth dimension, and is the gatekeeper, the doorkeeper. But it's also brings such sweet peace and balance to our lives. And so it's a wonderful one to just consistently honor. And I always encourage anyone, if they don't know what to do, but they're interested in Hinduism, to always kind of see if they have a connection to Ganesh, to study Ganesh, because he is the first place we should start. It's very gentle. He's a gatekeeper, a doorkeeper, much like Legba is in esoteric voudon traditions. We see that there's some kind of gatekeeper there. Right. Same idea. But Ganesh is beautiful because Ganesh has such a deep connection to Shiva and the goddess, both. And so it's this beautiful energy for that. So I would encourage you to, for the rest of your life, at least always offer a candle to Ganesh and images and continue to draw with him. It's a beautiful cosmic force.
Well, I mean, yeah, he definitely gave me a Sandalphon vibe, he's definitely very welcoming, but at the same time, I don't want to say standoffish, but stern in his approach, right?
Right.
He definitely, hasn't, come back in any specific, visions well outside of psychedelic experiences. I'm talking about specifically dreams. But, working with just that God form, it's definitely a very harmonizing energy. And, I guess kind of looking at the connectivity between like Ganesh, the angel Sandalphon, and you also mentioned Papa Legba from the voudon traditions. So when you perceive these God forms and you try and rationalize it, are these just like certain interdimensional energy points that can't be perceived with a rational mind, so they have to be expressed through a subjective experience?
I think I personally take the stance that these God forms that we experience or we can communicate with are distinct discarnate intelligences that exist in many different dimensions. I definitely don't see them as any kind of like psychological symbol or some kind of like symbol that we're trying to break down and kind of assure ourselves that it's not real. To me, these are very live, discrete entities that exist in other dimensions and that for various reasons either seek to communicate with us or because of our own unique karma, we already have previous connections to them and they open up with that. And that's a kind of a fundamental idea in Eastern traditions, is that this lifetime we have right now is definitely not the first one according to their perspective. And we've got a vast past experience of connections and things that are going on. And so I think that's a fundamental idea. Even my recent book, Cult of Golgotha, was all talking about some of these ideas.
Right. And I definitely want to touch on your theories about Golgotha a little bit later. Primarily as it acts as a specific gateway over to the other side.
Right.
But I guess I should rephrase that question. So do you think the human mind is limited in a way that because we can't experience these beings in full, that we have to symbolically perceive them because our mind just can't handle that full splendor or that direct communication?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that the majority of people's nervous system is not able to accept or to tolerate an experience of that, mainly due to societal conditioning and through how they live their lives. However, our brain and our consciousness can be two different things. From an Eastern perspective, consciousness is much above the brain. See, the Western mind says, no, the brain is our consciousness. But in Eastern thought, we would say, no, the brain is just the house of consciousness. The consciousness exists somewhere else. Even in medical, as a medical practitioner, we know that in our gut, we have a second brain. There's a whole other enteric nervous system that exists independent of the brain, and they actually can control the brain. So I think that, number one, that depending on one's esoteric practice, they can either have a more direct experience with these luminous or numinous beings, or they need a more symbolic practice. But also, too, I think that the mind works in symbols. The soul doesn't speak in literal words. It speaks in poetic forms. It speaks in artistic forms. And so I think that that's why many of these minds, and we can even look at ideas from the Vedas, where the rishis from India were writing in very kind of like symbolic language, where one word meant 10 different things depending on how you used it. That's how Sanskrit's created. So I think that's one of the ideas, is that so it depends on the person, it depends on the experience, it depends on the person's training, and then it depends on the person's karma. But that's what our yogic practice is always seeking to do, is to decondition the mind, decondition the nervous system, so that we can have the most pure and direct contact with these intelligence as we can.
Right, right. Well, I mean, and I guess that preparation is everything, because, from a Western perspective, what you're really doing is you're preparing for the creation. Well, I wouldn't say the creation necessarily, but the connection with, your individual personality with that solar consciousness, and then eventually, that solar body, once you can raise yourself to it. So I guess what sort of things that should we start out with to try and condition our mind to try and perceive these things?
I think number one is most people need to learn to purify their senses, and that typically comes through kind of starting to limit how much artificial stimuli they're receiving. And that's obviously a controversial thing, because most of everything we exist in now is artificial, right? Artificial light, artificial sound, technology. Right. So I think learning to return back to nature and spending time within the actual elements, spending a lot of time in the nature, around water, around mountains, around all the five elements, becomes very, very important for both healing our nervous system, but also kind of deconditioning and letting our nervous system calm down. And the more remote we are with our connection to nature, the harder and harder it can be to have contact with these things. And so that's number one. Number two would be the actual health of the nervous system via diet and via the health of the physical body. And so those things have to start somewhere in those levels.
Well, that's just so hard to do, though, particularly in this day and age. Every time someone puts down their cell phone, drives to the state park, goes for a walk, actually gets themselves out. Being in nature is a healing experience. You can just feel the stress just melt away from you as you're walking through it. You just get this sense of ease. But, it's just such a shame, because so much of society and how we have to interact is done through these artificial means that, I almost feel like modern society, we've lost our sincerity.
Yeah, we definitely, I would agree with you. I think that I discussed this in my book, Entering the Desert. I called it the virus of modernity. And that there is a concern with that is that the more and more we see technology as a god, the more and more we see technology as a savior, the more and more we lose a true human connection. And so I think the human connection, the person-to-person connection, is very important, and our connection to nature. Now, of course, this is obviously directly from Vedic traditions and Hindu and Eastern traditions, that there was a one-to-one, there was a Gurukula connection. There was a teacher and a student. There was a direct transmission from the teacher and the student directly there, not via the internet, not via texting, but you had to live with the teacher, you had to live there. And so I think that's very important for people to find living teachers, living traditions. And then after that, they have to find out, how artificial is their environment they're living with, how artificial is their diet, how artificial is their mental diet, and all those things come into play. And so that's just something people have to examine if they truly, really seek to have deep esoteric experiences outside of artificially induced experiences via drugs or via some type of computer stimulated reality. Then they're going to have to kind of see that the modern lifestyle can be a challenge. It doesn't mean that someone has to be a Luddite It doesn't mean that someone has to give up technology. It just means that someone has to at least know that they're disconnected and at least know to go back. I compare it always to at least knowing where your food comes from, right? People can be so disconnected from the fact that what they eat was actually grown by someone. And obviously we're seeing a little bit better of that now with we have the farm to table movements, or people are more interested in local farmers markets. But some people can be so disconnected from everything that they don't understand that if something happens with farming, that it's going to affect them. If something happens across the world, it's going to affect them. And so I think that is kind of a reflection of their disconnection from nature. And I don't have a really neat answer for people who say, well, I don't live anywhere near nature. Sometimes some of those things can't be replaced. That's why many of these traditions were kind of based around nature. They were based around sacred places. They were based around sacred nature objects, mountains, streams, oceans. But like you said, when people spend time in nature, their cortisol levels drop. They feel better, and a very clear experience.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I feel like not having that direct experience is what's detaching people from reality, because so many people focus on what they know or what they think they know, or they live vicariously through YouTube videos, through social media, whatever the case may be. People lose touch with what the real world is. And I mean, if you substitute social media or technology for direct actual experience, I mean, you're just supplementing someone else's perception of an event for what could be your own, right?
Exactly.
So I mean, it just, I don't know, it just surprises me how many people don't know or experience so many things.
I totally agree. I think that's something that it's a crucial part for people to have direct experience in things, and to go out and engage in the world, to go out and find things, to go out and travel. It's something that I certainly grew up having to do. And I think that people need to always understand that, they can't Google enlightenment. They can't Google a Gnostic experience.
Right.
They can't Google it. They can't Google an initiation.
And well, I guess one thing I definitely wanted to kind of use that as a segue to is that you had talked about your fascination with Rudolf Steiner when you were younger, and how that was kind of a bridge between your Eastern practices and the more Western tradition, and primarily. I want to say it was the early 1900s when he had his quote unquote gnosis, where he witnessed the Christ, and I mean that also ties in with the mystery of Golgotha as well. So just to kind of give us an explanation, can you go on about kind of his vision of Christ and how Christ relates to human evolution?
Yeah, I mean, when I was a young, I must have been about 11 or 12. I obtained a copy of Rudolf Steiner's Knowledge of Higher Worlds and Its Attainment, and that book completely transformed my life and my reality. To this day, I think it's one of the most important books ever written. Is from a spiritual, and that has different distinct spiritual practices, and he describes the chakras and his idea of spiritual science. And obviously, growing up in a kind of a loosely Christian, mystical Christian, Catholic background, the symbols of Steiner were very easy for me to wrap my mind around. Mm-hmm. They were very steeped in Christian ideas, and I was absolutely fascinated with his idea of the Christ idea of where Golgotha, he referred to it as the mystery of Golgotha, the actual, death, the physical incarnation and death, and the blood actually having to be shed and soaked into the earth plane, that as a result of that, the actual esoteric and the earth change, and was going to allow humans to evolve to a different level now. He didn't necessarily see Christ as some type of savior saving people. It was more that Christ came to transform the environment. This Christ being, this Christ consciousness came and transformed the environment, and after that, humanity could evolve into a different level. And that, I found that very inspiring. And I found his entire body of work, his ideas on eurythmy, biodynamic farming, and of course anthroposophic medicine, which to this day is very inspiring to me. It was such a diverse, eclectic body of work that was so powerful, and that really inspired me.
So let me ask you, how do you think, I guess his perception of Golgotha then kind of relates Christ to, the development of the solar body? And definitely correct me if I'm wrong here. I'm just going off some general assumptions. I haven't prepared anything, but the way I look at it, the tradition related to the creation of, the solar body or the solar mind is that it breaks you free from the cycle of reincarnation, and it preserves your personality within the etheric or the afterlife. And I've always felt that the death of Christ and the resurrection was really his solar body coming back. He had conquered death through conquering that cycle of reincarnation and establishing himself purely as a spiritual being and coming back and kind of showing that pathway.
Yeah, that's definitely accurate, and I think one of the most fundamental ideas about what Steiner would refer to as the mystery of Golgotha is that the earth plane and in particular the physical human body provides a extremely unique opportunity for the evolution of the soul, which is radically distinct from any other dimension, which is radically distinct from any other planetary realm, and that as a result of this transformation of the flesh, an alchemical environment of the flesh and the blood, which of course we know went on to become the sacraments, the body and the blood, they become literally, it wasn't a seeking of transcendence from this world. If in many ways it was actually a sinking into this world, and actually embracing of the flesh, embracing of the blood. And of course, the Christ figure didn't say, oh, I'm just going to just magically appear and transform everybody. It's like, no, it had to be incarnated, and it had to die, and it had to experience these things. And that's one of the mysteries of that, and that's one of the things that Tantra teaches. Tantra teaches that the flesh, the body, and the blood, these experiences of the senses do not necessarily need to be transcended. They need to be purified. They need to be seen as an alchemical doorway. And once that happens, then some pretty incredible things can happen.
Okay.
So, and we can even see this with traditions of even in esoteric voudon or traditional Haitian practices where spirits want to possess the flesh. They want to come in to experience the flesh.
Right.
They want to experience what's going on here, and they want to form pacts with people because they desperately need that. And it's not like, oh, we're so much better, we're so stronger, we don't need the flesh. Many of these spirits are like begging to come into the flesh, begging to have that chance to come here. And so I think that Steiner's had a very unique idea, and many that's gets very confusing, because when people say Gnosticism, they think that means, oh, it's this radical dichotomy between spirit and the flesh, and it means escaping from the prison of the earth. But that's just one school of thought. Many other schools of thought.
That's like primarily like Valentinianism.
Exactly.
Or like Sethianism. But I mean, Gnosticism overall, and you could put that along with the Illuminism movement as well, is a very wide umbrella. Very wide umbrella. But to just kind of backtrack a little bit, because I don't want to lose focus. So you were talking about purifying one's senses in the moment, so that you can open up a doorway to different, how'd you phrase it, a different dimensional plane?
Sure, different dimensional experiences.
So is that just like, through like a sense of like super focused, like mindfulness? Like how do you try and purify your senses, or what you're physically sensing at that time, by rejecting it, by like sinking in away from it?
That's the very fundamental practice of yogic practice, particularly the chakras. Each one of the chakras is connected to each one of the senses. and then through different types of mantra practices, through different types of yantra practice, to different types of ritual practices, the doorways of the senses are purified through experiences, visualizations, intonations. And for example, in India, the senses are called the indriyas, which means the gateway to the gods. And so the senses are an opportunity to experience, and oftentimes they would even refer to each of the senses had a rishi or a god living in them. So we have to just transform our ability of how we see reality, how we hear reality, how we smell reality, how we touch reality, and how we taste reality. And this is a fundamental idea in Ayurvedic medicine from India. It's a fundamental idea with Qigong, as the inner practices of Kung Fu, is that the senses have to be purified, or as we would say from William Blake, once the doors of perception are cleansed, we can see a different world. Right. We can see different things, and that's one of the reasons why I always talk about returning to nature and spending time in nature, is because if the senses are constantly bombarded with artificial colors, artificial sounds, artificial taste, they can never be purified. They're covered in what we would call Maya. They're covered in some type of cloth or filth or dirt. And then so we have to polish them, we have to clear them, so at least we have a chance. And so, of course, through deep states of meditation, there's many types of practices that's where India, Hinduism, Buddhism, all these have this hundreds and thousands of years of teachings on this, of these actual distinct practices that someone would have to do to start that. And there's a whole system. There's a system there. That's the thing. There actually is an esoteric system of a science, we would call it.
So I guess when you open these doors of perception, you start to become aware of things on the other side of the veil.
Right.
Now, do you necessarily think that you have to haven't reached that beatific vision of Christ, in Teferath, or enlightenment to be able to? I mean, is that the first step in opening that door of perception?
That's a good question. I think a lot of it just depends on someone's karma and someone's experience of where they are on their spiritual path. But I don't think it's not necessarily a linear path. It's not necessarily like there's a certain process that you are always going to go through. Some people can have radical experiences as a child and radically awaken. Some people can have traumatic experiences as a child and radically awaken. Other times it waits when they're older. Some people don't because they never try. So I think one of the benefits of using, like you mentioned, the Kabbalah and the Sephiroth, it provides a map. It provides a map for people to start at least exploring things. And then it kind of gives them a frame of reference. And they can take that frame of reference and start exploring. But oftentimes that once we know the map is not the territory, right? Once we kind of go off into those realms, we can see, oh, wow, okay, I thought it was going to be this way, but it's really that way. So I think that's one of the reasons why we always want to encourage people to have some kind of system, right? If they don't like Hinduism or if they don't like Buddhism, then at least have some kind of organized system that is giving them some type of structure to begin with. And then once they have that structure, then they start to, like you mentioned earlier, then they actually have their own personal experiences. Then they can actually start to understand the nuance of that, talk to others. But until someone has a direct personal experience, it's just words on a piece of paper. It's just a book on the shelf, and they have to try that. They have to try something. They have to follow some kind of path. And I think a lot of people, they'll say things like they don't have a teacher, they don't have a path to follow. But in this day and age, our access to information and teachers, and it's just overwhelming.
Yeah.
To this day, it just shocks me to this day what I can walk into a used bookstore and find on the shelf. That when I was 19, I had to be on a microfiche in a basement searching that hopefully someone had translated it, that I could maybe find it if I was lucky, and then maybe go to India and maybe find someone who could get me the translation of the book. It was such a journey, right?
Yeah.
And then now it's just people just can download it instantly, and they complain that they don't have a teacher, it's too hard, or I have to drive 2 hours to meet with someone. So that goes back to discipline. Like you were saying earlier, what we started off. And remember, Aleister Crowley said that Thelema was 99% discipline. And
Yeah.
that was what he said. He was like, and that's, so if you don't have 99% discipline, he would say, it's not going to work. You're not going to get anywhere.
Well, and I mean, and Crowley as well was such an interesting character because I mean, even if you look and this is, I'm just going to go off my personal experiences. Some of the first times I've actually ever come across actual Hindu, meditation rituals, practices was, back in, God, probably in high school, coming across, old issues of the equinox online. That was the first time I've ever been able to actually sit
Oh,
down
okay.
and practice some of that stuff. So, he was, for all the guff that he gets, he was very influential from bringing a lot of those Eastern practices and putting them in the hands of Western practitioners, primarily Americans.
Absolutely. I 100% agree. When I was a young person, I remember getting his work and being just totally excited that he was talking about yoga and these things. And I found it very inspiring. And I think that, that people are such a harsh critic of him today, trying to judge people by modern, quote, morals and I don't have any time for that. I think his body of work speaks for itself.
Well, and you know what I think is a lot of people, don't really judge him as much as they do the myth about him. The fact that he was having blood orgies, sacrificing animals, that he, what was it? There's even a conspiracy theory he was the father of George Bush. Like, it's ridiculous. But I mean, the one thing that he does the other thing that he did, I will say that, has had a lot of influences that he was so adamant about recording his own experiences that even someone like myself, who never really had an established teacher, or I won't say I don't have an established spiritual path, but when you don't have that community to be able to talk about those subjective experiences with, he wrote so many of them down in like The Vision and the Voice, Book of Lies,
Yes.
that you're able to kind of compare what you experienced to what he experienced, and it kind of it kind of gives you something to go off of.
I totally agree, and that's one of the reasons why I think even to this day I consistently recommend people to study magic without tears, because it shows a distinct communication back and forth that was just in letter form, which he was helping someone with their spiritual practice and giving advice via letters. And it was just amazing to see with that. And I think you're right that, people can see that and see, okay, someone was actually willing to do all these sacrifices, willing to do all this to try to have a glimpse of something beyond. And it's extremely inspirational.
Well, and it also, and I know this is going to probably kind of sound bad. He also gives us a roadmap of kind of what not to do, in the regard that, towards the end, all the exploration that he did definitely took its toll on him, whether it was, karmic or otherwise. But it really goes to point as an example that, some of us should have limits with pushing the boundaries of our own consciousness, or at least be aware that we should have boundaries and the consequences if we don't.
Yeah, I would say this. I think that gets brought up a lot. I mean, nothing makes me laugh more and also makes me sad more is to see people say things like, oh, if Aleister Crowley was so great, look how weak he looked when he was older, and he died with a shoebox of money under his bed, and so that means that nothing he did was important. And most of 99% of the people that say this, their lives are an absolute joke, an absolute failure.
Mm-hmm.
They can barely make it. They can barely make a living. They can't publish a single book. They can barely get through college if they even went to college. So I just don't even accept that criticism of them. Number one, there has to be people who have the courage to push the boundaries. If we do not have individuals who are willing to radically push every boundary, and that means the boundaries of the mind, the boundaries of the body, then we will never have evolution. Mm-hmm. And so that's a big thing. It's like going into space, right? It's like if we're going to explore outer space, that's a very dangerous thing to do. there's no guarantee that every ship we have is not going to explode in the air. But now everybody wants safety every time. Everything has to be 100% safe or we can't do it. But I can tell you this, in India and in tantric practices, they're extremely dangerous. And there is absolutely no guarantee that someone's going to be okay when they do some of this stuff. That's why so much of it is kept secret. That's why so much of it is only given to teacher and student. Right. So I think that Crowley can be an example. We can say like what not to do, but in my vision, it was like, here's an example of what we have to have people doing this. We have to have someone who has enough courage to do this, but we have to be realistic and understand and say like, okay, if they do this, there's going to be consequences. If we are, and I think that's what we need to remember, is that if we want to have a very serious spiritual practice, nobody rides for free. There's always going to be a price to pay for that, whether that's a price in money, relationships, longevity, physical health. It's always a price.
Right.
I think we have to always remember that. It's people seem to forget that now because it's so easy. It's so our access to stuff is just so quick now.
Well, I mean, I would say like he pushed the boundaries so much that in like a large. I don't even want to say that. I would say that he pushed the boundaries so much that I believe he directly affected collected consciousness going forward, because not too long after his life, you saw such a radical shift towards positive sexuality, psychedelic experiences. I mean, that whole shift in consciousness in that following generation, I feel, has a lot to do with the work that he and a lot of his followers were doing.
Yeah, it is pretty wild to think about that. I totally agree. Yeah, when you see that, what came after, very quickly after his death, it can be sometimes mind-boggling to consider.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, just particularly how much influence he had over different icons of the day, whether it was John Lennon or Jimmy Page, Jim Morrison, whatever the case may be. Heck, even David Bowie, I'm pretty sure. But I don't know. I would say just influencing that generation of artists has had a I would definitely say it sped up human evolution to the point of societal achievement, because within that 2 decade span from like the late 50s into the mid 70s, like you just saw a complete upheaval of so many social norms all at once.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, 100%. And I'm sure Crowley would have been happy about that. I mean, he would have seen his transmission of the Book of the Law, kind of blasting open a lot of those things, for better or for worse, depending on what your perspective was.
Right. Well, so just so anybody tuning in who doesn't really have or hasn't been following what we've been talking about, Crowley was a magician, and he was he was also a phenomenal poet. He was a mountain climber, explorer. He did all sorts of groovy stuff. But it's very similar to kind of the Christ consciousness that we were talking about then. His belief focused around, the rebirth of... there was a specific name. It wasn't Horus. What was the specific name that they gave him, or gave their version of Horus?
Rahu, which one's from the transmission of the Book of the Law? Or?
Correct.
Yeah, I mean, he went through all the different god forms, Rahu, Kuat, Nuit, all the different types.
Right.
In the Age of Horus, so he kind of went over different levels for them.
So I guess just to kind of bring everything together, how do you think that process, directly correlates between not only his definition of Horus, but also, the figure of Christ as well as Krishna?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I would say, for me and my practice, I mean, the idea of Krishna being a fundamental root consciousness that was evolving and transforming through many different incarnations through life. Even, Vedic traditions even see the Buddha as an incarnation of Krishna. Mm-hmm. And we could even sometimes wonder if Aiwas was a type of incarnation of Krishna. which I've written some essays on that, but I've never publicly published them. Perhaps in the coming year I might, but I think we have to wonder about that as was that a type of Krishna consciousness coming through for the day and age of that time? I find that idea particularly fascinating.
Well, I mean, it would definitely be something at least on par with, the secret chiefs, right? Or, a Christian Rosencreutz type being that, shows up and gives guidance to the philosopher or the magician, in their time of greatest need.
Right, absolutely. And I think that many of those, the ancient things from India have such more of a history. And a lot of the modern European, like the idea of the secret chiefs and these things, so much of that stuff was just taken directly from India, from Indian texts, from Indian legends. I mean, the theosophical groups, they just, pretty much took everything they could from the Eastern traditions and try to create something. So even as a young child in the day, I always just kind of wanted to kind of trace it back. Okay, where did this come from? Where did this come from? Where did this come from? Let's go back to the root. Let's go see where that was coming from.
So I guess, kind of, taking it back to its root. Where do you think that you had talked about earlier this energy stream that's passed down from teacher to student? You could see from a Western perspective, just to kind of give everybody a quick rundown. And please, Craig, correct me if I'm assuming wrong on any of these, but the energy stream that we're kind of talking about, they, from a Western perspective, claim it originates in around probably Mesopotamia and then was brought, and mind you folks, this is all mythologically, it was brought to the West by the Knights Templar when they were, protecting pilgrims from bandits and stuff on the road. But those influences were brought over and they were put into medieval society, and they affected a lot of different groups, whether it be Gnostic groups that came up afterwards, Rosicrucianism, and then was eventually brought in to the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which would have influenced Crowley and then a lot of other groups within the United States as well. So kind of looking at that energy that's kind of passed from master to student, where do you think that originates from? Is it from a certain specific plane, or is it accumulation of different energies?
Well, I first of all, I would trace it back much further than Mesopotamia. I would trace it back to what we now call India at the time, which at the time wasn't necessarily called India. It was just a greater landmass to Southeast Asia.
Right.
And there was definitely, that's why we see, the Rishi culture of it, what we now call India, was definitely traveling all over way before people thought people were traveling. They were making boats before people understood they were making boats. In the Rig Veda, we have mapped out even NASA satellites now, photography has proven that many of the riverbeds that they were describing in the Rig Veda did exist at the time. The astrological conjunctions, the building of boats, the traveling around. That's why we see so many symbols, even in Native American culture, for example, that we're using sun symbols like the swastika. Mm-hmm. That was same thing from India. It wasn't because both cultures were magically inventing it. It was because these cultures were traveling and communicating with each other. And so I think much of this comes from Southeast Asia and then kind of spreads out like a web into different cultures. Even the Druid culture has so much connected to the Vedic culture. So there's definitely a cross-pollination going on there. And then that as that traveled out, then it kind of, every time these seeds were planted into different cultures, it would, of course, the cross-pollination would occur. It would morph, it would change depending on localities, depending on literally genetic strains of the nervous system, different cultures, how they understood it, that you would go from there. But I typically, that's trace it back all to Southeast Asia. And of course we can look at, there is, some deep roots that come from Africa and Southeast Asia seem to be some very mystical doorways, which were kind of spreading out throughout the globe.
Right. Well, I mean, if you look at the story of evolution, when Homo erectus came out of Africa and started crossbreeding with different types of species to eventually create Homo sapien. That was one of the big. That was kind of one of the big gray spots that, like, it kind of goes back to that. What was Blavatsky and Pike's different theory about the original pure religion of light? I know it gets misinterpreted by like Hall and stuff as like an Atlantean style myth, but do you put any weight into that? That all this derives from a pure original culture that kind of through destruction of their own, just kind of had to spread across to try and preserve this tradition?
Well, I think I don't necessarily put any stock in anything from Blavatsky and Theosophy, to be honest with you. Most of that is a kind of like a creation of different kind of pseudo myths put together.
Right,
But I
right.
think what we're talking about is, was there initially a root spiritual tradition, and they would call that in India, they call that Sanatana Dharma, the eternal tradition. That there was originally an eternal tradition which was spreading out all over the different earths, and then as it spread, it adapted and modified itself into different cultures. So yes, I think there was. That's why we have, the Rig Veda is the oldest scriptures that we have, and these scriptures were, according to them, they date it back way further than the European scholars would date it. And they have the yuga theory, right? That there's different yugas and dimensions of time that's cyclical rather. We tend to see this linear time of Western time. But in India they see it. No, it goes back way, way longer than that. And so I think that the Sanatana Dharma concept, that there was an original culture of spiritual tradition, a solar-based culture, a fire-based culture, a culture that was communicating with the heavens, that was communicating with the elements, absolutely. And then that spread out into different cultures. And as it spread, it literally germinated in unique ways based on the locale and based on what was going on at the place.
Right. Now I guess
Now, the concept of Atlantis and things like that, being that those are, in my opinion, those end up being kind of pseudo myths that were kind of like glimpses of what might have been happening as the Sanatana Dharma culture came out. But we also know that there was catastrophes of environmental change constantly.
Right. Well, that and I mean the original Atlantis myth by Plato. He was using Atlantis as an allegory more than anything
Right.
else. To
Right.
talk about how societies can fall. But I guess I don't know. I guess something always. I feel like that's like something everybody feels the need to kind of reconnect with. Is this like this pure energy or this pure culture, this pure tradition, because particularly in the modern world, so much mystery has been removed from our culture. So much spiritual emphasis has been removed by, secular values and products and brands and logos and, all this competing information that, nothing seems like it's special anymore. And people, they need that connection. They need that connection to the mystery.
I 100% agree. And I think that there's a craving for that. There's a craving for some kind of root, eternal tradition. And that's kind of an echo of a craving to have an internal experience of that symbol of the flame that exists within the heart. That, in the Vedic scripture, they would say, inside every being exists a flame the size of the thumb. You are that. That's essentially what you are. And so I think people long for that. They long for that spiritual experience. They long for that connection. And as you stated, that's being completely sanitized and homogenized outside of contemporary world. And in particular, we see that with I call it a religion, of the religion of secular humanism, that seeks to eradicate anything that according to them, is either not scientific or not rational. And then I term that from a Steiner perspective. That's the example of Ahriman, which is a very dangerous force. And I wrote about that extensively in Entering the Desert and Cult of Golgotha. The idea of that this modern conception of despiritualizing and desacralizing everything in the name of science or the name of technology is a very, very dangerous concept.
Well, I mean, it's almost like, and I know this is going to be a bad example, but have you ever watched that show American Gods?
I have not. No, I'm familiar with some of that, but I have not seen it.
Well, yeah, just the whole idea of the old gods, right, being replaced by these new gods, whether it's the god of technology, the god of money, just kind of. I mean, it's an allegory, for that loss of that mystery. But
Hmm.
I guess I don't know. Why do you think that we're evolving in this way? Is it just the age that we're in, or is it like a concerted effort to attack kind of our collected consciousness?
I think both. I think and I made a very big, strong point in the Cult of Golgotha to state that it is a concerted effort to limit the expansion of human consciousness. There is a type of cosmic balance between acertic forces and dark forces and light forces, which is always going on. And I think that so there is that aspect. There is definitely an attempt to dehumanize people, to de-individualize people, and to easily control people. We see that constantly. I mean, for God's sake, advertising does it.
Yeah.
So if you think one single ad agency in New York City does this, but massive government agencies don't, I mean, come on. That's what our entire organ, and that not just the American, every country's government does this. Every country's secret service does this. Every country's security services does this. This is a human condition, and so I think we have that without a doubt. And then if the more people are lazy, the more people are unhealthy, the more people have artificial stimuli, the less they're going to be even interested in changing something like that. And that's we could talk about the Gnostic hymn of the pearl. That's the whole idea behind that, is that people forget who they are, and they've forgotten who they are, and sometimes people need to come back and remind them. Whether or not they listen, that's hard to say.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, I feel like just the modern world in general, just the way our society is structured, it's just to repress that. Most people, they go through their day to day jobs feeling unappreciated, never feeling that they're, a reflection or just a shard of the great divine. But they just work their 40 hours a week. They come home, or if they're working more than that, they're so tired they can't, and they're so focused on paying bills that they can't really focus on what should be important, which is, our psychological and spiritual development.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that they tend to live in an artificial rhythm. They tend to live in artificial structures, and they aren't actively seeking for true sources of inspiration and true sources of passion. And I think you touch upon something. Is a lot of people complain about their jobs, but and I often tell people that our jobs aren't necessarily supposed to be spiritual. Our jobs aren't necessarily supposed to be some kind of radical awakening point, but what we do when we go home from our jobs, and what we do on the times we're not in our jobs, can be radically spiritual. And then we can take that back into that realm. And then also too that if someone is having a job they don't like, then they should change that.
Yeah.
That's a big part, is radical too. So but you bring up a very important point. Modern society is not structured to encourage spiritual awakening. It's not structured to encourage independent thought. So if you have those things, our modern education system is not even encouraging people to be free thinkers, much less spiritual beings.
Well, and that in our education system is just so backwards. Like, all right, like the United States education system overall was developed to produce factory workers, because that was
Yeah.
it was organized during the time of the Industrial Revolution. So that was its point. It was there to create people that would sit down, put their head down, sit and work, not complain, and not ask questions, and just do what they're told, because that was the economic force of the time. And so many people, and one, that's not education. You're not learning anything that's going to be of use for yourself besides being able to keep a job. But you're not growing, you're not learning, you're not expressing your individuality. And I don't know, I feel like at least in the last few generations, like that has become more of a focus for young people. I was talking to Dr. Barbara Reisman a couple weeks ago on the show, and we were talking about, millennial versus boomer identity. She did a bunch of books on gender identity. And the one thing that we were talking about was how millennials versus boomer, how we choose to identify is way different than previous generations. The previous generations, they would identify more with their vocation. They would take pride on that because, a corporation would take care of you back then. But
Absolutely.
most millennials, they don't have that reassurance from their corporation or their jobs, so they don't really identify or try and find purpose through that. So you're seeing such a push for trying to define yourself through artistic expression, spiritual exploration. I mean, really the whole or the whole structure that society is in to repress that is actually starting to create a reformation of that kind of thought.
Yeah, I mean those are very good points, but I think a lot of it has to do with discipline and personal responsibility too. That everyone, we can't expect corporations and jobs to support us and make us completely happy. That we have to see our spiritual path as something that in many ways exists independent of that. Because that's even what I wrote in Entering the Desert. It's like the world, it can be a very desert. it's never going to be necessarily an inspiring place unless we change our perspective, unless we change the way we look at it. That's the troubling thing I see sometimes with the younger generations now is they're expecting everything to just already be happening for them. They expect everything to be just kind of given to them, or they expect things to be easy. And the older generation sees the exact opposite, right? They're like, no, I had to work very hard for this. I had to earn this. And so we have these two clashes of forces, and there has to be a middle way between that. And until there is, there's going to be a lot of disharmony, a lot of discord. And I think that's a challenge. And that's why I think a lot of the younger generation who embrace secularism has turned, virtue signaling and politics into their religion.
Yeah,
And
which I mean, that's almost like self-objectification at that point. If you turn your political party into a religion, then you're trying to identify as a Democrat or a Republican. Like that's not going to give you the same kind of fulfillment as finding your own spiritual expression.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I mean, I don't know. Just going back to the desert, that was such a beautiful allegory because at surface level, the desert is a very cold at night, desolate place with no life. Everything looks dead. But when you take a deeper look, there is so much life in the desert. It's just underneath the surface.
That's exactly why I wrote Entering the Desert. That's literally the exact reason I wrote it, and to show people that, listen, that what on the surface looks one way. If you look deeper, it's something different. And that was obviously influenced by the concept of Maya from India, and that if we have Maya, that can be an illusion, it could be a covering, but also if we learn to kind of pull that covering back, we can see great beauty in the world. And so that's why I thought the desert was a beautiful analogy for that. So thank you for bringing that up.
Oh, well, absolutely. And I definitely wanted to talk about that book because that's probably the book I'm going to end up getting from you. Excuse me. So Entering the Desert was more of your reflection on your spiritual exploration thus far. It was basically your thoughts and your experiences on that path. So kind of, kind of walk us through that book, kind of what you went through and what inspired you to finally put it down on paper.
Yeah, the germination of Entering the Desert came to me while in the Tibetan desert, and I had already written Tantric Physics Volume 1, Cave of the Numinous, and I was already at work on Tantric Physics 2, and then I had a very strange experience in a cave in Tibet, and I had this vision of this other book called Entering the Desert, and I wasn't quite sure what to do with it, and so it kind of germinated for a couple years. And what I wanted to do and it had a strange kind of vision, strange allegory. It's like the book was already there. I just had to kind of pull it out of the ethers. But I essentially wanted to write a book that did not have any Sanskrit terms, that did not have any confusing verbal concept, that was directly speaking in a language that everyone could understand, but also provided some kind of fundamental structure of a spiritual path, of some type of esoteric path. And I found the desert allegory to be very inspiring. And so I kind of mapped out a whole vision of how someone could build a spiritual practice, how someone could build their sacred area of worship, how they could learn how sleep was important, how diet was important. And then I even gave kind of some different kind of rituals through that about reconnecting back to nature. And then there was an inspired text in there called the Desert Grimoire, which I kind of transcribed into it as well, too, which is deeply esoteric transmissions about what happens if someone experiments that. So what I really wanted was that people could read during the desert, and if they were a Christian, they could go off into their esoteric Christianity and use that. If they were a Buddhist, they could take some tools from that and go back into Buddhism. If they were a Hindu, they could go to Hinduism. If they were a Thelemite, they could take Entering the Desert and take those tools and go into Thelema. Anything they were doing, I wanted it to provide some kind of tools for that. And I felt until I got that out of my system, it was going to be something blocking from writing my next book. And then, so that's kind of why I did it. And I'm very, very honored by its reception. And its response, and the overwhelming amount of letters and messages I receive about that book is very inspiring, and I'm honored. And it's something that I hope people will take and then help to create either their own systems or to help them re-inspire them in whatever path they had.
Well, and I guess that, just kind of going back to Crowley, that was one of Crowley's main messages, as well as Bertio from your
Yes,
Gnostic influence,
absolutely.
is create
Absolutely.
your own system. So I guess just to kind of backtrack on that, because I definitely do want to push forward into creating your own system and how to do that. So when you were kind of receiving this, was there any specific god or spiritual being that you were working with, like a holy guardian angel, or was it a specific god form?
No, I mean, I think I was on a trip to Mount Kailas, which was obviously based on Shiva and the goddess, but going there through some strange areas in Tibet, and some of the strange areas in Tibet are very weird, and it's almost like a Bon type of shamanism that exists in those realms that even predates what they would call Buddhism, and so I think that was some type of strange. I call it a daemonic energy that exists, not demonic, but daemonic.
Right. More
that exist in that exist in that realm, which allowed me to kind of tap into some kind of experience that I had, and of course I was definitely, I'm glad you brought that up. In my conversations with Bertro, he was always adamant about asking me to please show that we can continue to create our own systems. And that is essentially what he was doing, to tell people not to copy him. And so Entering the Desert was in many ways deeply influenced, and then went on to become, the second volume, Cult of Golgotha, was trying to show people that, you have to we have our own, I like to call it, our Gnostic nostalgia. We have our own past history of esoteric study that all should be building up to some kind of trajectory of life. And then we can take all that and then create our own unique system. Just like a musician has their own life experiences, he or she learns different art forms and then creates their own original music. They don't just play cover songs for the rest of their life. That is someone who's a true musician. So esoteric practice is the same way. If we would have a root tradition, which we were steeped in study, and then as we grew and evolved, we were going to have some kind of unique experiences. And as a result of those unique experiences, we should be able to produce something, to be creative in some way, whether it's through art, poetry, text, spoken word, something. And I think that's an important concept.
Well, I think that's what makes Bertio particularly so interesting, is that, like, and And folks, I know some of you have no idea what we're talking about. This where we're talking about super fringe religious elements right now, which is related to threads of French Gnosticism, Illuminism, voodoo. It all just kind of meshes in such a beautiful way. And just to kind of give you a little, just to kind of give you something more to sink your teeth into, folks. So, as many of you know, I'm a big fan of comic books, and one of the comic series and writers that was very, very heavily influenced by Berthiaud was Grant Morrison. Grant Morrison, doing the Invisibles comic series, actually takes some specific spiritual entities right from the tradition. So, you could definitely just kind of look into that, and it'll fill in a lot of gaps for you. But when it comes to Berthiaud, when did you first get introduced to him?
I must have been in my mid-20s, and I read Kenneth Grant's works, and Kenneth Grant had mentioned Berthiaud in his groups, so I found a way to write to Berthiaud and get the monastery papers.
The Monastery of the Seven Rays, right?
Yeah, and so for when I was in my mid-20s, I deeply studied the monastery papers. That was something which was so strange and so weird and really, really inspired me. And then, of course, the collections of the Voudon Gnostic workbook were eventually going around. Back in that time, it wasn't just on a bookshelf. And I managed to get some information to get that. And so I found that to be even weirder and strange. But I found it very inspiring, and I found it a deeply eclectic mix which was informed with deep study of different types of esoteric traditions. And so it was always kind of there on my shelf, and it was always something which I always studied, even when I was traveling to India, when I was studying those kinds of things which I would still consider my foundation. I always had a deep love for I call it the élan vital of Berthiaud, his fearlessness, his creativity. Those two things I found in his eclecticism, I found very inspiring. Then eventually, we communicated, and he helped me with a lot of my work, inspired me in a lot of different ways, and we have a interesting relationship with that. And so that was one of the reasons why I kind of wanted to write Kulta Gagatha, was because he asked me to. He said, please show people what you're doing with my work. This is very interesting. He would say, it doesn't seem like other people are doing this like you are. Can you please write this? And I felt like it was important for me to do that out of respect for him, out of respect for his work, and to show that what he said, he wanted people to write their own grimoires. He wanted people to write their own work. He was giving people tools to create their own systems.
Right.
And I don't think people are using his work that way, which is, to me, very frustrating. And it's frustrating to him as well, too.
So I guess, if you could kind of give us a little bit of a background on Berthiaud's philosophy and outlook on consciousness, because I tried reading through the Gnostic Voudon workbook, and I just keep getting lost and primarily a lot of it is because it's written to confuse. It makes you reread things and ponder things, and kind of project a lot of yourself on it to find its meaning. But if you could give us your interpretation of a lot of Berthiaud's ideas and how we should progress consciousness, I think that'd be very beneficial.
Yeah, I think fundamentally it's impossible to understand Berthiaud's ideas unless you trace back through Berthiaud's education. Berthiaud was deeply steeped in study of philosophy, Heidegger, Jung, Hegel. So all those concepts come to mind. And then you also look at what the occult groups that were going on in Chicago in the 70s. That was huge. And you had a very strange eclectic mix. And then you had the French Haitian occultist kind of streams come through, and the strange kind of Kardec spiritualism, which was coming through. All that was kind of coming through, and even his theosophical kind of inspirations were feeding into Bertrand's very creative mind. And then Bertrand was able to take all these systems and to start kind of literally painting different magical worlds with them. And I think one of the fundamental problems happens is that people only buy the Voodoo Gnostic workbook and that's all they read. And that's the Voodoo Gnostic workbook was like essentially supposed to be, that came after the monastery papers.
Right.
So if someone has not read the Monastery of the Seven Rays, the 4 years of that, then nothing will make sense to them hardly at all. And the Voodoo Gnostic workbook is not organized in a way that's linear. It's kind of thrown together. So a lot of people don't know that. So I always encourage people to please get their hands on the Monastery of the Seven Rays papers, to read his other works like Cosmic Meditation, and then understand that the Voodoo Gnostic workbook is just an eclectic mix. It's not meant to be, a linear experience.
Right. It's not like a specific grimoire.
Right. Exactly. And so it literally, so I think that's the fundamental area where people get confused with. And then a lot of people learn about Michael Bertrand through the writings of Kenneth Grant, which in and of itself is quite creative. And then they're always, my biggest complaint about people with Bertrand is that they never just read Bertrand. They're usually trying to read a discussion of Bertrand, or they want to read Bertrand through Kenneth Grant, or they want to read Bertrand through something else. And so I think just like Crowley, if you want to understand Crowley, you have to actually read Crowley's work. You have to study Crowley's life, and you have to look at the time that he lived in and the education he had. The same thing is with Bertrand. You have to actually read Bertrand's work. You have to look at the time he was living in, look at his education system, and then you'll start to understand. You'll get a lot of clues with that as well. But essentially, the Monastery of the Seven Rays papers needs to be examined before someone can really start to kind of dig into the Voodoo Gnostic workbook.
So, well, I mean, I guess, and, please clarify on this, but, when it comes to, like, the paintings of, different spiritual realms, the one thing about the Voodoo Gnosticism is that artwork and artistic expression is such a focus in it. It's almost as if, when you're painting these beings, you're creating, like, a talisman of that specific experience that you had. And so can you kind of go into the use of artwork as a way to evolve consciousness?
Absolutely. I think that that's one of the fundamental ideas of the Bertrand kind of influenced ideas, is that everything we do, whether it's through word or whether it's through image, has the potential to be a living expression of a cosmic intelligence. And that's what we seek to do with art. But I kind of always want to emphasize that people tend to think that art just means just painting, but it could also be music. Yep. It could also be spoken word. It could be the art of someone's life if they understand certain things correctly. So that's essentially what they have to do with that. It has to be done that way. But Michael, of course, is an artist, and he loves to paint and he loves to draw. And so he has a proclivity to that. And so that's going to be expressed through that. But anything that we can kind of ground, that's from India, right? That's what yantras are. There's these geometrical designs that are beautifully done that kind of embody the goddess, embody the spirit. And so I think we should always remember that anything that we can create on our own, whether it's a drawing, a sound, a paper, a word, it has the ability to house the spirits, to create a doorway. And then, of course, the ultimate piece of art is our body, the flesh. And so then as we can fashion and move and transform the flesh, that becomes a sacred canvas as well.
All right. Well, so let me ask you, do you think it's... I guess as we kind of open these windows of perception, that these different energy forms or beings try and express that through artistic expression? Like, do you think they are kind of giving that inspiration kind of the way the muses would to create those physical plants in our world?
Yes, I mean, I think.
Well, I was going to say maybe not plants, but like more anchor points, Yeah. I understand. Yeah, I think, it's important to understand that a lot of the concepts of from the soul and ideas that exist in the soul realm,
they can't be expressed through rational thought. And they can typically only be expressed through images and through suggestion. And so art has the great ability to suggest, to hint, and to be like a pointer, but it's not a clear, perfect description of it, because we can't do that in many linguistic terms. So we struggle with that. But through images, through sound, through color, and particularly through poetry, we can express many different esoteric concepts, and so that's where art of all forms becomes very important.
Well, then I guess when you at least the way I look at it, coming from an artistic background as a painter as well. I mean, even when you meditate, when you do a spiritual ritual, like I try and look at that as a piece of performance art, because it allows you to kind of put your mind and intention more sincerely into what you're doing at that time.
Absolutely, I totally agree, without a doubt.
So I guess that use of creative energy. I mean, well, I guess if you want to be godlike, the one thing you have to look at is the one thing you can definitely say that God did was creation, right? So the more you create and the more you are in tune with that creative energy, the closer you are to God.
Right. It does. The more we can create, the more we can start to exist in the soul realm and to have glimpses of the soul, or I like to call it a soul-centered life, that we were able to start to feel that in all the aspects of our life. And I think that's one of the things that is lacking in the modern world, the contemporary world, is the lack of creativity.
Right.
And the less creativity we have, the less chance we have for true individualism, because that's the thing. Everyone likes to say they're an individual, but when you look around, most people just want to have group speak. If you have anyone who thinks anything out of the norm is demonized or doxed or called dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
But creativity should be very unique, very individual. And so that's a really important thing. The more creativity you have, the more true individuals we have. And that's a direct reflection of the beautiful diversity of the cosmos.
Yeah. Now, I guess the one thing, because we're getting towards the end here. So the one thing I will say is, the other week I had Greg Kaminsky in, and the entire discussion was how, we can use this pandemic as a way to try and be more spiritually focused. So coming from your background, what can people do now that we have so much time to be indoors and to be focused on these things? What can people do to be more soul-centric?
Well, I think in general, people need to definitely learn meditation more, to have some kind of practice of meditation and some type of practice of learning how to breathe correctly, pranayama of some sorts. Those two things are fundamental. That obviously is very nuanced, and there's lots of different options for that. Outside of that, people need to educate themselves more on spiritual practices, to actually take the time to sit and study spiritual practices. That the study of spiritual texts in India was called svadhyaya, and it was a very sacred practice. They felt that just the actual study of a sacred text was a type of spiritual practice in of itself. It wasn't just reading. It's much like Lectio Divina, that it was some kind of sacred reading. So I think people need to look at that. And then I think people need to focus on, is their body, are they taking care of their physical body? Is their physical vitality healthy? Are they eating healthy? Are they sleeping healthy? And so I think that's the fundamental basis of those different types of things. And outside of that, even during a pandemic, we can go out into nature. And this would be a great time to go out into nature, to reconnect with nature, to reconnect with the primordial rhythms, the cycles of day and night, outside of the artificial limitations they have, and hopefully to try to find some kind of inspiration to bring back to their everyday world.
That's beautifully said. So I guess, folks, let's do something with me real quick here, just to kind of put some of this into practice. So, folks, here's what I want you to do. Next Wednesday, get some get a small canvas, get some paints, right? Light some candles, lower down the lights, maybe put some incense on, and just find a nice steady breathing pattern, something that's deep but is comfortable for you. And I want you to think about the angel Raphael, or if there's a different, god or figure that you want to put in its place, definitely do it. But I want you to focus on the power of healing. I want you to think about all that healing energy going into that canvas, and I want you to sit while you're in this mindset and just sit and paint it. And just sit and express yourself pure expression. Don't try and have any influences, just come and let it flow naturally. And then what I want you to do is I want you to take that painting, I want you to put it away, and I want you to ignore it for about a week. And then I want you to take it out and I want you to put it in your car. And I want you to remember that it's there. And someday on the street, you're going to see someone, because I've done this many times myself, and they're going to look sad. They're going to, you'll know it. You'll know that that painting is meant for them. So when you come across this person, give them that artwork for free. Watch their face light up and know that that intention, that healing intention that you manifested through your creation into this painting is helping that person wherever they are. Craig, I want to thank you for coming on the show. You definitely have a great perspective on life, and I'm definitely going to want to pick your brain going forward off of the chat about various esoteric subjects. So I want to thank you again. And, if folks want to go ahead and connect with you, ask questions, or just inquire more about your acupuncture nutritionist practice, what can they do?
Oh, thank you. It's been an honor to be on the show, and thank you so much for the stimulating discussion. I'm pretty easy to get in contact with, for better or for worse. They can go to my website, which is ayurvedaaustin.com. They can also just Google Craig Williams Acupuncture, Craig Williams Ayurveda. And, of course, all my works are published by Anathema Publishing, so they can go to the Anathema Publishing website and find that information there as well.
Fantastic. Well, I want to thank you for sharing this time with me, and it was a fantastic discussion. I got a lot out of it. I hope some folks at home who are listening got as much out of it as I did. And, remember, folks, when entering the desert, always remember the window of perception is open. Good night, folks.
Take care.